everyone, welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about equilibrium. We're basically going to put together supply and demand and see what happens. If you think about the word equilibrium, you might be thinking equals. So we're going to see pretty much where X marks the spot. So make sure you're in your interactive notebook and you're following along. All right, everyone, we're on page 7 of your interactive notebook. And again, we're talking about equilibrium. Again, on this sheet, we're going to have a series of questions that we're going to look at the top of each slide. And on your sheet in the right-hand side, those blue boxes, that's where you're going to be filling in your notes. So let's talk about first and foremost, what's our essential question? What is equilibrium and how are market prices determined? That's our essential question for today. So what is equilibrium? As I hinted in the beginning, equilibrium has the root word in there of equal. So equilibrium is going to be the point at which quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal and they intersect on the graph. So if we were to, like you can see on the screen here, plot out a demand curve and a supply curve together on a graph, they're going to intersect. Because remember, our supply curve goes up, our demand curve goes down, even though I'm going up, but down, I don't know, they make an X. And there's a spot where they intersect. So equilibrium is going to be where quantity supplied and quantity demanded intersect. It's also going to be a point of balance or where price and quantity are both equal, as you can see on this graph as well. That little spot in the very center, that's the point of equilibrium. Now, any place that's not at equilibrium, that's going to be disequilibrium. So it's going to be any place where it's not equal. So it's anywhere that quantity supplied does not equal quantity demanded, and it's any place, again, where price and quantity are not meeting. So it's anywhere else all over that graph. Equilibrium is one specific point on this graph. Now, with equilibrium, we're going to have two phenomenons known as excess demand and excess supply. Excess demand is when we're going to have too many consumers, not enough product. Excess demand, too much demand. So this is going to occur when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and it's going to create shortages. Think about like Christmas time. A lot of this usually happens like Black Friday shopping. There's a lot of demand for products, but the producers are only releasing a certain amount of that product. You know, let's say that Best Buy only has 400 TVs that are going to be sold for $200 or whatever a good price for a TV is these days. After that, it's done, or they go back up to the regular price. So I'm sure there's going to be more than 400 people that are going to want a TV. So the supply is low, but the demand is high. So it's going to cause a shortage. Excess supply is the exact opposite. It's when we have too much product and not enough consumers. This is when the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And this is going to cause the opposite of a shortage, known as a surplus. This is when we've got too much stuff, nobody's buying. It just kind of sits there, collects dust on the shelves because nobody wants it. So probably the price is set too high, most likely, and there's no demand for that product. Now, what does this all look like when we put it all together? We do have a market supply schedule and a market demand schedule that we plop together. As you can see here, I use the example of pizza. So we have the quantity demanded, we have the price of a slice of pizza, we have the quantity demanded, we have the quantity supplied, and what that's going to result in. So as you can see, at 50 cents, the demanders, the consumers, are going to be really happy. We like buying cheap stuff. So we're going to demand 300 slices of pizza. But our producers of pizza, they don't want to sell cheap pizza. They like it when prices are high. So they're only supplying 100 slices of pizza. The number 300 is much larger than 100. So here we're going to have shortages from excess demand. The flip side of that, at $3, you and I are thinking right now, like, $3, I don't want to spend $3 on a slice of pizza. So only 50 slices are demanded. But our suppliers are like, cha-ching, we want to sell it at that price. So I want to make a lot of money. So we're supplying 350. So again, we have a surplus from excess supply. The place in which we are happy is at $1.50. 200 slices are demanded, 200 slices are supplied. That is our point of equilibrium. So again, you can see that down here on the graph. Equilibrium is smack dab in the middle at $1.50. 200 slices are demanded and supplied. Anywhere else is going to be our excess demand down here, and then our excess supply. And again, the way in which you know you have excess supply or demand, if you notice our demand curve is blue, sloping down. On the right-hand side, we have an increase in prices or increase in quantity. You know, it's over the higher numbers, 250, 300. But our supply is over the lower numbers, 100, 150. There is more demand than there is supply. The same is true for excess supply at the top. Our supply is over the high numbers. Our demand is over the low numbers. We have more supply than we do demand. Now, we do have shifts in equilibrium like we had with the demand curve and the supply curve. Good news, there's no determinants of equilibrium. We don't have another timer tiger situation here. Bad news, you have to figure out which one is it talking about. So if we were to look at a headline, we have to determine, is it talking about the supply of the product or is it talking about the demand of the product? And sometimes that can be very challenging. So that's why we're going to go through a few examples a little bit later. But first, let's look at what would happen if we shift the supply and demand curve. All of the principles that we talked about when we shift the supply and demand curve are going to apply here. They're just going to look very goofy because we have both the supply curve and the demand curve here. We also have this crazy dotted line with the EP and the EQ, which we'll explain in a second. But again, the principles are the same. It's just going to look odd. What we need to do with equilibrium, we have to think about, this is our original point of equilibrium for whatever we're talking about. We're going to have an original equilibrium price and an original equilibrium quantity. So just like before, we had 200 slices of pizza being supplied and demanded at $1.50. Remember that. Now, let's say with this one, we're saying a shift, we're going to have an increase in demand. Something other than price happens. So think about your timer. Change in tastes and preferences, consumer income, members of population, consumer expectations, and those related goods. Something there causes an increase in demand. Same as before, you would go to your demand curve and shift it to the right and cause an increase. With that, we get a new point of equilibrium. Because of that, we also get a new equilibrium price and quantity. So what I'm asking for over here, what I'm looking for, we have to talk about how did we get from this point here, our original point of equilibrium, to our new point of equilibrium. What did we have to do to the price and the quantity to get there? In this scenario, we had to increase the price and we had to increase the quantity to get back to equilibrium. I'll tell you, demand plays nice because if we have an increase or a decrease, everything follows. Supply is going to be a different story. Demand, if we have a decrease in demand, it's going to be the exact opposite. We shift the demand curve to the left to show a decrease. We have a new point of equilibrium. And again, we had to decrease our price and decrease our quantity. On the other hand, we have supply. Here again, we want to think about something is causing an increase in supply, a change in technology, a change in the cost of inputs, a change in a government subsidy, a change in producer expectations, a change in regulations and taxes, or a change in the number of suppliers. Something that causes, other than price, for our supply to increase. So we go to our supply curve, we shift it to the right to show an increase. Again, we go from this point of equilibrium to now our new point of equilibrium shown by our blue lines. Now here's where we get a little tricky. You have to pay attention to these lines, and that's why I draw out these dotted lines so we can see where we went. If you see over here the price actually, although it says 1 and 2, that doesn't mean like we increased from 1 to 2. It just means like this was the original, this is our new one. You notice if we go from this price to this price, we actually decreased the price to get back to equilibrium. If we go from this original quantity to our new quantity, we actually increased. So you can see these arrows don't play like they did with demand. They actually go opposite. Now, again, if we have a decrease in supply, we're going to go to our supply curve, shift it to the left to show a decrease. We have our new price and quantity, and then we go from our original price to our new equilibrium price. So we show an increase there. And then from our equilibrium quantity, we go from our red original equilibrium quantity to our new one. You'll see that we actually decreased. So you just have to pay attention. I still, as a teacher who's been teaching this for almost 13 years, I still have to write this out. So usually I have a scrap sheet of paper, I write it out. No joke, I do it every time. So usually that does help. So think about that, maybe doing that. The last thing that I want to do in this video, because it's going to help you with one of your assignments, it's not going to be the exact same headlines, but there might be a couple. We're going to go through a few scenarios with a couple different headlines. So this is something that you might want to come back to later and watch, especially when you're going to work on that assignment, the equilibrium headlines assignment. And as always, although you might be first watching this in the Edpuzzle, this video will also be posted in the Schoology folder under class notes and screencasts outside of an Edpuzzle, so you won't have to do it again, just the YouTube video. So we're going to look at some examples. So we're going to talk about how the following headlines might affect, everything's going to affect the demand or the supply for Nike sneakers. Just use a random example. So we're going to have a series of different headlines. We're going to have one headline is going to be the fact that the price of rubber increased. We're going to have the fact that there is some sort of a movie and it increased the popularity of Nikes. We're going to have 2 new Nike factories opening up. And then we're going to have a price reduction on all Adidas styles. So let's break this down and talk about these 4 different headlines and how they would affect, again, the price for Nike sneakers. Now, the first thing you need to do on the top of each slide, that's going to be our headline. The first thing you have to do is figure out, does it affect supply or demand? Because if you choose wrong and you shift it, all this is going to be the wrong thing. Okay. So what we're looking for in this scenario, we're going to look for the determinant. And then we're going to talk about what happens to price and quantity to get back to equilibrium. Now, if you think about the price of rubber, okay, what does that have to do with sneakers? You want to think in a sneaker, it's made with rubber. So it's an input. So now you have to think about which Tiger or Timers talked about inputs. And you should remember that we have costs of inputs. So our determinant here is the costs of inputs. So this is a supply. It's going to affect the supply. So now thinking about the price of rubber, if it increased, that means it's more expensive. You as a producer, if it's more expensive for you to acquire rubber, now that's going to influence the supply of your Nike sneaker because that goes into making it. So that's going to cause your supply to decrease. So we shift it to the left. Again, we have 2 new points of equilibrium, our new price and quantity. So in order to get back to equilibrium, we would increase the price and decrease the quantity. So increase the price and decrease the quantity to get back to equilibrium. Our next example, a movie increases the popularity of Nike. How, again, will this affect the market for Nike sneakers? So a key word here when you're trying to figure out if it's supply or demand, we're looking at popularity. So think about Timer and Tigers. What was a determinant that talked about like popularity or trends or fads or celebrity endorsements? And you should be thinking about tastes and preferences. So our determinant here is tastes and preferences. With that, that means we're going to only focus on the demand curve because remember, tastes and preferences affects the demand for a product. So if a movie increases the popularity of Nikes, that's going to probably increase the demand for Nikes as well. So we're going to take our demand curve and shift it to the right. With that, we get a new point of equilibrium. And so looking at our price and our quantity, if you remember, I said whatever this line does, all of this is going to follow with it. So we're going to have an increase in both price and quantity to get back to equilibrium. Our next example, 2 new Nike factories open up. How does that affect the market for Nike sneakers? Again, a huge key word for trying to figure out if it's supply or demand, factories. The only group that's going to be concerned with factories are going to be producers, because they're the ones who are going to be owning those factories. So if we have 2 new factories opening up, that's going to be our determinant of number of suppliers. There are more suppliers of Nike sneakers because there are more factories. So in turn, that's going to cause the supply of Nike sneakers to increase. So we're shifting our supply curve to the right. Again, our new point of equilibrium. Price is going to decrease to get back to equilibrium, and the quantity is going to increase. Our last example, a price reduction on all Adidas styles. How will this affect the market for Nike sneakers? We have contrasting companies here, Adidas versus Nike. So thinking back where we talked about different types of goods where you could substitute one in for the other, that would this be here. So we want to think back to timer, which would be the effect on demand. So we have the determinant would be related goods of a substitute good. We're going to focus on the demand curve. If we have a reduction in price on Adidas sneakers, meaning Adidas are less expensive, more than likely that's going to cause our demand for Nike sneakers to decrease. So we go to our demand curve, we shift to the left. Again, it's going to decrease because the Nike sneakers are going to be less expensive. So most people are motivated by price. So they're going to go buy the Adidas sneaker and demand less of the Nike sneaker. So our new supply, or our new point of equilibrium, has dropped here. Again, we showed a decrease, so everything is going to follow suit. Our price and quantity are both going to decrease in order to get back to equilibrium. A lot of information in this video. Again, equilibrium, biggest thing is to know that it's the point at which supply and demand, or quantity supplied and quantity demanded, meet. And this is where generally we are happy because everybody who is supplying and who is demanding have the same price and the same quantity, but it's not that we're always going to be there. It's kind of like utopia. It doesn't always happen. So producers and consumers have to play around with the prices in order to get back to that. So that's our market price. So we're always trying to get as close to equilibrium as possible. And we want to stay out of disequilibrium because remember, we have that problem of excess demand and excess supply. So thanks for watching. Make sure this is in your interactive notebook, and we'll see you next time.